A billionaire who lost his wife in a devastating accident faced yet another nightmare when his young daughter was suddenly kidnapped months later. However, one fateful day, the household servant unexpectedly arrived with a shocking revelation that left him utterly stunned. The golden glow of the morning sunlight filtered through the grand windows of the Kingston estate, painting the dining room in hues of warmth and life. The faint clink of silverware on porcelain mixed with the occasional giggle of a 4-year-old, creating a melody that Charles Kingston wished he could bottle and preserve forever. "Emma, sweetheart, chew before you speak," Margaret Kingston chided gently, a soft smile on her lips. Her blonde curls caught the sunlight, forming a halo that made her look almost angelic. Across the table, Charles lowered his coffee mug, a rare grin gracing his usually composed features. "I wasn't speaking," Emma protested, her mouth full of pancake as she waved her fork for emphasis. Margaret shook her head, laughing before sliding her chair back. "All right, little Miss Chatterbox," she teased, pulling a small velvet box from her pocket. "I have something for you." Emma's eyes lit up as Margaret opened the box to reveal a delicate silver necklace, a small charm shaped like a heart, inscribed with the name Emma. "It's beautiful," Emma squealed, clapping her syrup-sticky hands together. Margaret leaned down, fastening the chain around her daughter's tiny neck. "Now you'll always remember," Margaret said softly, her voice brimming with warmth. "Mommy and Daddy love you, no matter what." Charles reached across the table to touch his wife's hand, his usually steely eyes soft. "She'll know, Margaret. Always." The day unfolded with the brisk efficiency that defined Charles's life. By mid-morning, he was buried in phone calls and paperwork in his office. Margaret had left to take Emma to preschool, her laughter still echoing faintly in the halls. Charles caught himself glancing at the clock often, already anticipating their return. And then the call came. "Mr. Kingston?" The voice on the other end trembled. "There's been an accident." The world seemed to tilt as Charles gripped the phone tighter. Words like collision and emergency room reached his ears, but they sounded distant, like whispers carried on a storm. His mind latched onto a single thought: Margaret and Emma. The drive to the hospital felt like an eternity, every red light a stab to his already frantic heart. When he arrived, a young nurse met him at the door, her face drawn and pale. "Mr. Kingston," she began hesitantly. "Your wife." "Where's Emma?" Charles interrupted, his voice sharper than he intended. "She's in pediatrics," the nurse said quickly. "She's stable. But your wife—" Charles didn't wait to hear the rest. He pushed past her, his footsteps echoing in the sterile hallway as he made his way to Emma. His heart hammered as he entered the room, finding his daughter sitting on the edge of the bed, her silver necklace catching the fluorescent light. "Daddy!" Emma's small voice broke the silence, and Charles felt his knees buckle. He crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling her into his arms. She clung to him, her tiny hands gripping his suit jacket. "Where's Mommy?" she asked, her innocent gaze searching his face. Charles's throat tightened. He couldn't answer. Instead, he held her tighter, his tears falling silently into her hair. The days that followed were a blur of funeral arrangements, condolences, and the unbearable weight of loss. Charles moved through the motions like a ghost, his usual commanding presence dulled to a shadow of itself. Victor Kingston arrived the day after the funeral. Charles found him standing in the study, gazing at a photo of Margaret on the desk. Victor turned at the sound of the door, his dark eyes filled with something that resembled sorrow. "I came as soon as I heard," Victor said, his voice low. "I should have been here sooner." Charles said nothing, his gaze fixed on the photo Victor had been staring at. Victor stepped closer, placing a hand on Charles's shoulder. "You've lost so much, Charlie. Let me help. Whatever you need." For the first time since Margaret's death, Charles felt the tight knot in his chest loosen ever so slightly. He nodded, letting the presence of his younger brother fill the silence he could no longer bear. "I'll hold things together at the company," Victor offered. "You focus on Emma." Charles immediately agreed. He wasn't sure what else to do, and Victor's offer of support felt like a lifeline in a sea of despair. Late one night, as the rest of the house lay still, Charles stood in Emma's room. She was fast asleep, the faint rise and fall of her chest a reminder of the fragility of life. His gaze fell to the silver necklace that glinted faintly against her tiny collarbone. "I'll keep you safe," he whispered into the quiet. "I swear it." The sterile smell of the hospital lingered in Charles's senses as he carried Emma out of the building, her small arms wrapped tightly around his neck. Her blonde curls tickled his cheek, and her silver necklace glinted faintly in the sunlight. It was the first time he'd stepped outside with her since the accident, and he couldn't help but feel the weight of both relief and guilt. "Daddy," Emma said softly, her voice still fragile. "Are we going home now?" Charles tightened his grip on her, his heart aching at the faint tremble in her words. "Yes, sweetheart. We're going home." The days that followed were a quiet blur of routines and adjustments. Charles cleared his schedule, dedicating every moment to Emma. They played with puzzles on the living room floor, read her favorite storybooks, and shared quiet meals at the kitchen table. For the first time, Charles realized how much he had missed these little moments, the simple joys that now felt immeasurably precious. Yet, there were moments of silence too, when Emma's gaze drifted to the empty chair at the dining table, or when she asked in her small voice, "When will Mommy come back?" Each question was a blade to his heart, but he answered with as much strength as he could muster. One afternoon, as Emma carefully colored in her picture book, Charles sat beside her and said, "How about we go to the park tomorrow, just you and me?" Emma's eyes lit up, the first spark of joy he had seen in weeks. "Really, Daddy? Can we feed the ducks?" Charles smiled, ruffling her curls. "We'll do whatever you want, sweetheart." For the first time since the accident, the house felt less like a monument to grief and more like a place of healing. Tomorrow, he thought, would be a step forward for both of them. The laughter of children rang across the sprawling green of Aldridge Park, a lively symphony of joy that felt strangely out of sync with Charles Kingston's heavy heart. He sat on a bench near the playground, his gaze following Emma as she ran between swings and slides, her curls bouncing with every step. "Daddy, look," Emma's voice cut through his thoughts. She stood proudly atop the jungle gym, her hands on her hips like a miniature conqueror. The sunlight caught the tiny silver charm around her neck, making it gleam. "I see you, sweetheart," Charles called back, mustering a smile. "Careful up there." "I'm careful," Emma announced, her voice carrying over the chatter of the park. Charles leaned back, closing his eyes briefly, letting the warmth of the sun soak into his skin. For a fleeting moment, the weight of the past few months felt distant, almost bearable. The sound of a child crying jolted him upright. His eyes scanned the playground until they landed on the jungle gym. But Emma wasn't there. Panic surged through his chest as he stood abruptly, his voice sharp. "Emma!" No answer. He weaved through the throng of parents and children, his heart pounding louder with each passing second. "Emma!" His voice cracked, drawing curious stares. Near the swings, a woman looked up from her book. "Are you looking for someone?" "My daughter," Charles managed, his breath catching. She was wearing a blue dress, about this tall with blonde curls. The woman shook her head apologetically. "I'm sorry." "I haven't seen her." His pulse roared in his ears. He sprinted toward the park's entrance, scanning every face, every corner. "Emma!" The desperation in his voice turned heads, but no one stepped forward with answers. By the time the police arrived, Charles was a wreck. He clutched Emma's stuffed bunny, left behind on the bench, like a lifeline, his knuckles white. "Sir, we're going to need a description of your daughter," an officer said, his tone calm but firm. Charles struggled to form words, his mind stuck on the image of her standing atop the jungle gym, the sunlight catching her smile. In a darkened van, far from the park's cheerful chaos, Emma sat huddled in a corner, her small frame trembling. A coarse blanket scratched against her arms, and the air smelled of oil and sweat. She clutched her necklace, the cool silver pressing against her palm like a whisper of comfort. A man with a gruff voice barked something to the driver, his words clipped and hurried. Emma flinched at the sound, but bit her lip to keep from crying. Mommy had told her once, "If you're scared, hold tight to something you love. It'll help you be brave." For days, Charles refused to leave his study, poring over maps, police reports and surveillance footage until his vision blurred. Victor became his shadow, a steady presence with reassuring words and endless patience. "We'll find her, Charlie," Victor murmured one evening, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. "I promise." Charles didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on a grainy image on the screen, a blurry figure carrying a small child into a van. He traced the outline of the child, willing it to reveal something more. Victor's hand tightened slightly before he stepped away, his face unreadable. "I'll handle things at the office. You focus on Emma." Hundreds of miles away, Emma's new home was a dilapidated house on the edge of a forgotten town. The wallpaper peeled in strips, and the air was thick with mildew. Her room, if it could be called that, was a small, windowless space with a cot and a bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. "Get up!" A sharp voice yanked her from sleep one morning. A woman with harsh eyes and a permanent scowl stood at the door, a broom in hand. "Floor's not going to clean itself." Emma scrambled out of bed, clutching her necklace as she hurried to obey. The woman's eyes lingered on the silver charm, her lips curling in disdain. "You won't be needing that soon," she muttered, turning away. The days blurred into one another, filled with endless chores and stern reprimands. Emma's small hands became raw from scrubbing floors, her shoulders sore from hauling firewood. The nights were worse, a suffocating silence broken only by the creak of the old house settling into the ground. But through it all, she clung to the necklace, running her fingers over the engraved letters when no one was looking. It was the only thing that felt real in a world that seemed determined to erase her. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would close her eyes and remember the warmth of her father's embrace, the sound of his voice calling her name. But those memories grew fainter with each passing day, like a dream slipping away upon waking. Back at the Kingston estate, the once bustling halls had fallen silent. Charles sat in Emma's room, the faint scent of her lavender shampoo lingering in the air. He picked up one of her picture books, the corners worn from tiny fingers, and traced the cover with trembling hands. "Daddy loves you, Emma," he whispered to the emptiness, "no matter what." But the words felt hollow, swallowed by the silence that had taken root in his home and his heart. The clock ticked endlessly in the quiet study, each second a reminder of the days, weeks, and months that had passed since Emma's disappearance. The once organized desk was now cluttered with police reports, maps, and half-drunk cups of coffee. Charles Kingston sat hunched over, his fingers tracing red lines drawn between locations on a map of Aldridge Park and its surrounding neighborhoods. His suit hung loose on his frame, his tie forgotten, his eyes bloodshot from nights spent searching for answers. A knock at the door broke his focus. "Come in," Charles croaked, his voice raw from disuse. Victor stepped inside, his usual composed demeanor wrapped in a veil of concern. "Charlie," he began, his tone soft but measured. "It's been months. The police, the private investigators. Everyone's doing their best. But you're running yourself into the ground." Charles didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gestured at a stack of surveillance tapes on the desk. "Did you know there are cameras all around Aldridge Park?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Not one of them caught a clear shot of her. Not one." Victor hesitated before stepping closer, his hand resting gently on his brother's shoulder. "I understand your pain," he said quietly, "but you have to let this go. Emma wouldn't want you to." "Don't tell me what my daughter would want," Charles snapped, shrugging off Victor's hand. His voice trembled with anger and desperation. "I won't stop until I find her. She's out there somewhere, Victor. I know she is." Victor took a step back, his expression unreadable. "All right," he said after a pause. "I'll handle things at the office. Focus on what you need to do." The next day brought a flicker of hope, or perhaps a cruel trick of fate. Charles's phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Kingston." The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost apologetic. "My name is Alan Ward. I think I've seen your daughter." Charles's heart raced. "Where?" he demanded, clutching the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "In a small village called Henslow. It's about 3 hours north. I was passing through and saw a girl who looked like the one on the flyers." Charles didn't wait to hear more. Within minutes, he was in his car, the engine roaring to life as he sped out of the estate gates. The drive was a blur of winding roads and frenzied thoughts. The village of Henslow was small and unremarkable, with narrow streets lined by aging stone houses. Charles parked near the town square, clutching a crumpled flyer with Emma's photo in his trembling hand. He showed the picture to shopkeepers, passers-by, anyone who would listen. "Have you seen this girl? Blonde curls, 4 years old, her name is Emma." A man outside a bakery frowned, scratching his chin. "Might have seen someone like that near the old mill," he said finally. "There's a family living out there with a little girl." Charles felt a surge of hope. He thanked the man and rushed toward the mill, his heart pounding harder with every step. The building was derelict, its windows boarded up, its walls streaked with grime. Charles hesitated at the door, his breath coming in shallow bursts. Gathering his courage, he knocked. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing a gaunt woman with sunken eyes. Her gaze flicked to the flyer in his hand, and her lips tightened. "What do you want?" she asked curtly. "I'm looking for my daughter," Charles said, his voice firm but strained. He held up the flyer. "She looks like this. Blonde curls, 4 years old. Please, if you've seen her." The woman's eyes darted to something inside the house before she stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "You've got the wrong place," she said, her tone sharp. "Please," Charles pleaded. "I just need to see her. If it's not her, I'll leave. I swear." The woman shook her head and stepped back inside, slamming the door in his face. Charles stood frozen for a moment, his hands clenched into fists. A sound from the back of the house caught his attention, a faint, childlike laugh. His heart leapt. He moved quickly, circling the building, his footsteps muffled on the overgrown grass. Through a crack in the boarded window, he saw her. A little girl sat on the floor, playing with a battered doll. Blonde curls framed her small face, but the features weren't quite right. Her nose was slightly broader, her cheeks fuller. It wasn't Emma. Charles staggered back, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. His vision blurred as he leaned against the wall, struggling to breathe. The drive home was silent, except for the hum of the engine. Charles gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched. The pain in his chest was unbearable, a deep, gnawing ache that refused to fade. When he finally pulled into the Kingston estate, The house loomed dark and empty, mirroring his own despair. The dim light in the cramped room flickered, casting shadows that danced across the peeling wallpaper. Emma sat, huddled in a corner, clutching her knees, her silver necklace resting lightly against her chest. Her small fingers traced the engraved letters, her lips moving soundlessly, as if repeating a mantra. Daddy loves me. Mommy loves me. It was the only tether she had left to a life she barely remembered. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Emma's head snapped up, her breath hitching as the door creaked open. She expected the harsh voice of the woman who barked orders at her daily, but what stepped inside froze her in place. "Uncle Victor?" she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. She scrambled to her feet, her knees wobbling. "It's you. It's really you. Please take me home, please." Victor stood in the doorway, his sharp suit an odd contrast to the decaying room. His face was unreadable as his eyes swept over her frail form, pausing briefly on the necklace that glinted faintly in the dim light. "Quiet," he snapped, his tone cold and clipped. Emma recoiled as if struck. "Uncle Victor, it's me, Emma. Don't you know me?" Her voice cracked, desperation spilling out like a dam breaking. Victor stepped closer, his polished shoes kicking up dust from the creaky floorboards. He crouched down, his face inches from hers. "I don't know what nonsense you've been telling yourself," he said in a low, venomous whisper. "But I'm not your uncle. Do you hear me?" Emma's eyes widened, tears pooling as she shook her head. "No. You are. You are. Please." His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist tightly. She winced. "You're going to stay here," he hissed, his voice a cruel mockery of the kindness she once remembered. "And you're going to keep your mouth shut. Understand?" Emma's sobs caught in her throat as she nodded quickly, the words too heavy to form. Victor released her wrist with a shove and stood, brushing invisible dust from his suit as if disgusted by the contact. Without another glance, he turned and strode out, leaving Emma crumpled on the floor, clutching her necklace as though it were the only thing keeping her from falling apart completely. In the kitchen of the dilapidated house, Victor leaned against the counter, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was smooth, almost charming. "She's getting too comfortable," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Make sure she understands her place. No more crying fits, no more tantrums. Be firmer with her." On the other end, a gruff voice responded affirmatively, and Victor's lips curled into a satisfied smirk. "Good. Keep me updated." He ended the call, slipping his phone into his pocket. Before leaving the house, Victor passed by Emma's room again. Through the crack in the door, he saw her sitting motionless, her back to him, her small shoulders shaking as she clutched the necklace. His eyes flicked to the glint of silver, and an idea crept into his mind, like a shadow. Back in his sleek, modern office, Victor sat at his desk, the necklace now resting in his palm. He twirled the silver charm between his fingers, admiring its simplicity. To him, it was more than a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of his triumph, a token of his control over both Emma and Charles. He opened the drawer of his desk, revealing a velvet-lined box where he carefully placed the necklace. He closed the drawer with a click, leaning back in his chair as he poured himself a glass of scotch. The amber liquid caught the sunlight streaming through the window, much like the necklace had caught the light around Emma's neck. A knock at the door drew his attention. One of his associates entered, handing him a folder. "The latest on the company acquisitions," the man said, his tone professional. Victor barely glanced at the papers. "Perfect timing," he murmured, taking a sip of his drink. His eyes lingered on the drawer where the necklace lay hidden. The pieces are falling into place. Meanwhile, back in the crumbling house, Emma sat on her cot, staring at her empty hands. The absence of the necklace felt like a physical wound, a gaping hole where her last fragment of hope had been. She touched her bare neck, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. She thought of her father, his warm embrace, the sound of his laughter. But those memories now seemed hazy, like trying to recall a dream. Upon waking, she clung desperately to the faint whispers of his voice in her mind, repeating the words she so desperately needed to believe. "Daddy loves you, Emma. Always." But with every passing day, the echoes grew fainter, and the darkness of her current world pressed in closer. "Daddy," she whispered into the silence, her voice trembling. "Please find me." Victor sat in his office, his expression smug as he leaned back in his chair. The game was far from over, and he held all the pieces, or so he thought. The necklace, now hidden away, was just another part of his grand scheme. The Kingston estate buzzed with an energy it hadn't seen in months. Laughter and the gentle clink of champagne glasses echoed through the grand halls, mingling with the soft strains of classical music from a string quartet in the corner. Guests in tailored suits and glittering gowns moved with an ease that felt almost obscene in the shadow of Charles Kingston's grief. Victor Kingston, always the impeccable host, glided through the crowd like a master conductor. His charming smile and perfectly timed condolences made every guest feel both seen and needed. "This evening is for Charles," Victor declared to a small group gathered near the fireplace. "He's been through so much. If we can bring him even a sliver of peace, it's worth it." In contrast, Charles sat at the far end of the room, his posture stiff and his glass of untouched whiskey clenched in his hand. His eyes darted toward the large windows, where the soft glow of the garden lights barely pierced the darkness beyond. Victor thought this might help, a guest ventured, breaking the silence as she sat beside him. Charles turned, his expression blank. Victor thinks a lot of things. He downed the whiskey in one harsh gulp and stood abruptly. "Excuse me." Away from the gathering, in the quiet sanctuary of the second-floor study, Mrs. Harrington, the long-time Kingston housekeeper, worked diligently to organize the clutter left by the day's preparations. A meticulous woman, she had served the family for decades and knew every corner of the house like the back of her hand. As she dusted a high shelf, her cloth snagged on the corner of a sleek mahogany box tucked behind a stack of ledgers. Frowning, she pulled the box down and wiped it clean. Something about its presence felt odd. She had never seen it before. Curiosity getting the better of her, she opened the lid. Inside, nestled against the soft velvet lining, was a delicate silver necklace. The heart-shaped charm gleamed under the lamplight, its inscription catching her eye. "Emma." Mrs. Harrington's breath caught. Her hands trembled as she closed the box and clutched it to her chest. She knew the necklace. It had been around the little girl's neck every time she'd seen her. But how had it ended up here, hidden away? Downstairs, Victor worked the room with the precision of a seasoned puppeteer, ensuring every thread of conversation looped back to his brother's resilience or the strength of the Kingston name. He kept one eye on Charles, who had rejoined the party but remained detached, his presence a mere shadow among the guests. As Victor accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server, Mrs. Harrington appeared at the edge of the room, her face pale and strained. She moved quickly, but carefully, her expression one of controlled urgency. "Mr. Charles," she said softly as she approached him, "may I speak with you privately?" Charles turned to her, his brow furrowed. "Now?" "Yes, sir. It's important." Victor's gaze followed them as they slipped out of the main hall, his practiced smile faltering for the briefest moment before returning to its polished sheen. In the quiet of the study, Mrs. Harrington placed the mahogany box on the desk in front of Charles. Her hands lingered on the lid for a moment, before stepping back. "I found this while tidying," she explained. "I thought you should see it." Charles opened the box, and the sight of the necklace hit him like a physical blow. His breath caught as he picked it up, the familiar weight and coolness of the silver pressing against his palm. He turned the charm over, tracing the engraved letters with his thumb. "Emma," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yes, sir," Mrs. Harrington said gently. "It's hers, isn't it?" Charles nodded slowly, his mind racing. Emma had been wearing this necklace the day she disappeared. He had clung to the hope that it remained with her, a tether to the family that loved her. Yet, here it was, hidden in his own home. "Where exactly did you find this?" he asked, his tone sharper than intended. "In the office," she replied, glancing toward the shelves. "Behind the ledgers. I don't know how it got there." Charles's jaw tightened as he set the necklace back in the box and closed the lid with a decisive snap. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrington. That'll be all." She hesitated, her eyes filled with concern, but nodded and left the room. Alone now, Charles stared at the box, as if it held all the answers he desperately sought. His thoughts churned, piecing together fragments of conversations, stolen glances, and lingering doubts. Victor had always been the comforting presence, the reliable brother who shouldered the burden of the business, while Charles spiraled in grief. Something not right. He needs to find out. The days following the discovery of Emma's necklace were a blur of sleepless nights and ceaseless worry for Charles Kingston. The glimmer of doubt that had taken root in his mind now consumed him entirely. Victor's smooth reassurances, his unwavering composure, it all felt wrong, like a mask hiding something far more sinister. Charles sat in the dim light of his study, the mahogany box holding Emma's necklace sitting on the desk before him. He stared at it, his thoughts spinning. The only person with the access and opportunity to hide it there was Victor. But why? There was only one way to find out. Charles hired a private investigator, a seasoned professional named Harris, known for his discretion and tenacity. "I need answers," Charles had said, his voice firm but strained. "Whatever Victor is hiding, I want it uncovered." Harris nodded, his demeanor calm. "I'll start immediately, Mr. Kingston, but I'll need your patience. These things take time." Time. It was the one thing Charles felt he didn't have. Days turned into weeks as Harris pieced together Victor's movements. At first, there was little more than routine business meetings and casual social events. But then, patterns began to emerge. Unusual visits to remote locations, meetings with individuals whose names sent shivers down Charles's spine once Harris revealed their connections. "Your brother has been meeting with individuals tied to known trafficking rings," Harris reported one evening, sliding a file across the desk. "This one in particular," he said, pointing to a name, "was flagged in multiple investigations." Charles felt the air leave his lungs as he scanned the reports. Each word felt like a hammer blow, driving home a truth he wasn't ready to accept. Fueled by suspicion and rage, Charles decided he couldn't wait for more evidence. He needed to see for himself. Under the cover of night, he drove to Victor's private office in the city. The building was silent, the halls dimly lit as he slipped inside, using the spare key Victor had given him years ago, a gesture of trust that now felt bitterly ironic. Victor's office was as polished and pristine as the man himself. Every surface gleamed, every paper neatly filed. But Charles's eyes were drawn to the locked drawer in the heavy oak desk. He searched the room until he found a small key tucked away in a desk organizer. The drawer opened with a soft click, revealing a folder thick with documents. Charles's hands trembled as he flipped through them. Receipts for large sums of money, contracts with vague but suspicious wording, and then a photograph. It was Emma. Her blonde curls were unmistakable, though her face was pale and her expression frightened. She was standing in front of a run-down house, held tightly by a woman with a harsh, scowling face. Charles's vision blurred as he gripped the photograph tightly. The rage building within him was tempered only by the crushing weight of guilt. How could he not have seen this? How could he have trusted Victor so completely? Further into the folder, Charles found a series of financial transactions, payments made to the family in the photograph. It was all there, laid bare in black and white, the proof that Victor had orchestrated Emma's disappearance. Charles sank into the chair behind Victor's desk, the photograph clutched in one hand and the folder in the other. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as the pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place. Victor, his brother, the man who had stood by him in his darkest moments, had been the architect of his suffering. The betrayal cut deeper than anything Charles had ever known. His mind raced with questions. Why? What could possibly drive Victor to do this? Was it jealousy, greed, some twisted sense of power? But above all, one thought consumed him. Emma. She was alive. She had to be. But what had she endured during these months, left in the hands of strangers who had no love for her? The thought of her suffering, her fear, her confusion, it was unbearable. Charles slammed the drawer shut and rose to his feet, the photograph and folder in hand. He couldn't confront Victor yet. Not until Emma was safe. He needed a plan, one that would ensure she was rescued without tipping Victor off. Back at the estate, Charles sat in Emma's room, the faint scent of lavender still clinging to her pillow. He placed the photograph on the bed, staring at her image, as if willing her to hear him. "I'll find you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll bring you home. I swear it." The folder of evidence lay open on the nightstand, its contents a stark reminder of the danger Emma was still in. Charles knew that every move he made from this moment forward had to be calculated, precise. Victor was cunning, but Charles's love for his daughter would drive him to be smarter, stronger. Before retiring for the night, Charles opened the mahogany box on his desk and took out Emma's necklace. He held it tightly in his fist, the cool metal pressing into his skin like a promise. As he placed the necklace around his own neck, tucking it beneath his shirt, he made one final vow. "You may have taken her from me, Victor," he murmured, his voice low but unwavering, "but you'll never take her hope, and you'll never take mine." The Kingston estate was unusually active at dawn, its calm shattered by a quiet yet urgent flurry of preparation. Charles stood at the center of it, speaking in low tones with a detective from the local precinct. The evidence he'd amassed, the photographs, the ledger, the damning recordings, lay spread across the desk. "This is enough to act on," the detective confirmed, his brow furrowed. "But we have to move fast. If Victor or his people suspect anything, they'll disappear and take her with them." Charles's jaw tightened. "Just tell me what you need from me." The detective hesitated. "Stay back. Let us handle it." Charles shook his head. "No. I'm coming with you. She's my daughter." The detective opened his mouth to argue, but the look in Charles's eyes silenced him. The convoy of unmarked cars rolled into the rural outskirts just as the sun began to rise. Charles sat in the back seat of the lead vehicle, his hands clenched tightly around the silver necklace in his pocket. Every bump in the road seemed to amplify his tension, each passing second stretching unbearably long. "This is it," the detective said as they approached the decrepit house. "We've got officers covering every exit. Stay here until I give the signal." But Charles was already out of the car, his determination unshakable. Inside the house, Emma sat on the edge of a cot in the dimly lit room that had become her prison. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew, and the faint sounds of movement from the rest of the house made her flinch. Her small hands clutched her knees, her fingers pressing into her skin as if to anchor herself. The absence of her necklace weighed heavily on her, an invisible wound she couldn't heal. A sharp knock at the door made her heart leap. Moments later, the gaunt woman who controlled her fate stormed in. "Get up!" she barked. "We're leaving!" Emma's eyes widened, but she didn't move fast enough. The woman grabbed her arm, yanking her to her feet. Outside, the detective gave the signal, and the officers moved in. The first team breached the front door with practiced precision, their shouts echoing through the house. Chaos erupted as the occupants scrambled to escape, but they were met with officers at every turn. Charles pushed past the officers, despite their protests, his heart pounding as he navigated the unfamiliar halls. He heard muffled sobs from behind a closed door and knew, instinctively, that Emma was there. He burst through the door, his eyes locking onto the small figure huddled in the corner. "Emma," he whispered, his voice breaking. The gaunt woman lunged toward him, but an officer quickly restrained her. Charles barely noticed, his focus entirely on his daughter. Emma's face was pale, her cheeks hollow, her eyes wide with fear. She shrank away as he approached, her body pressed against the wall. "It's me, Emma," Charles said, his voice trembling with a mixture of relief and heartbreak. "It's Daddy. I'm here to take you home." But Emma didn't respond. Her gaze darted around the room, searching for an escape. When Charles knelt and reached out to her, she flinched, her small hands coming up to shield her face. The sight broke him. "Emma," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. Tears streamed down his face as he lowered his hand, his heart shattering at the realization. She didn't remember him. Minutes later, the scene was secure, and the officers were escorting the remaining suspects out of the house. Charles stayed on the floor beside Emma, giving her space, but refusing to leave her side. One of the detectives entered the room, his face grim. "We've got everyone," he said. "It's over." Charles nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Back in the car, Emma sat silently beside him, her small frame rigid and unyielding. Charles didn't push her to speak. Instead, he pulled the silver necklace from his pocket and placed it gently on the seat between them. Emma's eyes flicked to the charm, her fingers hesitating before reaching out to touch it. She picked it up slowly, turning it over in her hands, as if trying to place its significance. "You used to wear that every day," Charles said softly. "Your mother gave it to you." Emma didn't respond, but her grip on the necklace tightened. When they arrived back at the Kingston estate, Emma clung to the necklace as if it were a lifeline. Charles carried her inside, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the road to healing would be long and fraught with challenges. But as he laid her down in the room he had kept ready for her, untouched since the day she disappeared, he allowed himself a glimmer of hope. "I'll never let you go again," he whispered, though he knew she couldn't yet trust the words. As he closed the door, Charles vowed to himself that he would rebuild her trust, piece by fragile piece, no matter how long it took. The room was uncharacteristically cold, despite the sunlight streaming in through the large windows of the Kingston Estate's private office. Charles sat behind the grand oak desk, a folder of damning evidence before him. Across from him sat Victor, casually leaning back in the leather chair, his confident smirk a stark contrast to the tension in the air. "So," Victor drawled, gesturing at the folder, "I assume you called me here for a reason, Charlie. What's all this?" Charles didn't answer immediately. His eyes bore into Victor, searching for some flicker of humanity, some trace of remorse. But there was nothing, only the smugness of a man who believed he had already won. "I trusted you," Charles said finally, his voice low but steady. "You stood beside me while I grieved. You held my hand through the darkest moments of my life. And the entire time, you were the one who orchestrated my suffering." Victor's smirk faltered. Just for a moment. "What are you talking about?" he asked, though the forced casualness in his tone betrayed him. Charles opened the folder and pushed it across the desk. Inside were photographs, transaction records, and a detailed timeline of Victor's meetings with known traffickers. But the final blow was a picture of Emma, scared, pale, and far too small for her age. Victor's eyes flicked to the photograph before he leaned back, his smirk returning. "So, you've been busy," he said, his tone mocking. "And? What's your point?" "My point," Charles said, his voice rising, "is that you took my daughter. You had her ripped from me, left her with strangers who abused her. And for what? Money? Power? Tell me, Victor. What was it all for?" Victor didn't flinch. Instead, he reached for the glass of water on the desk and took a slow sip before responding. "You always did like to play the victim, Charles. Poor, grieving Charles, burdened by his perfect little family and his untouchable empire. You never left room for anyone else, certainly not for me." Charles clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. "This was about jealousy. You ruined my life because you felt overshadowed." Victor chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "Jealousy," he repeated. "No, Charlie. This was about balance. You had everything, and I had to scrape for what little was left. You were always the golden boy, the one our parents worshipped, while I was the afterthought. Taking Emma wasn't about jealousy. It was about leveling the playing field." The door to the office opened, and 2 detectives entered, their presence cutting through the tension like a knife. Victor's smirk wavered as he looked between them and Charles. "What's this?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Charles stood, his posture commanding. "This is justice, Victor, for Emma, for everything you've done." One of the detectives stepped forward, his badge glinting in the light. "Victor Kingston, you're under arrest for conspiracy, human trafficking, and child endangerment. You have the right to remain silent." Victor shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. "You can't be serious," he barked. "You're going to believe him? Over me?" Charles didn't answer. He simply watched as the detectives cuffed his brother and began leading him out. As they reached the door, Victor twisted to look back at Charles, his expression dark. "You think this changes anything?" he sneered. "You think finding her will fix it all? She won't even recognize you, Charlie. She's probably forgotten you exist." Charles's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Victor leaned closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Even if you find her, she'll never love you. You've lost, brother. Just like I wanted." As the door closed behind Victor, silence settled over the room. Charles remained standing, his hands gripping the edge of the desk as he tried to steady his breathing. Victor's words echoed in his mind, each one a barb aimed at his deepest fears. Would Emma remember him? Would she still see him as a father after everything she'd endured? He picked up the photograph of Emma from the folder, his fingers trembling slightly. The image of her small, frightened face filled him with equal parts anguish and determination. "I'll bring you home," he murmured, his voice breaking. "And I'll make sure you feel safe again, no matter what it takes." Charles spent the rest of the day preparing for what came next. He worked with the private investigator and the authorities to finalize the rescue plan, ensuring that every detail was accounted for. Victor's network had been dismantled piece by piece, leaving no room for him to warn the family, holding Emma. By nightfall, Charles sat alone in Emma's room, the faint scent of lavender still lingering in the air. He ran his fingers along the edge of her bed, the memories of bedtime stories and whispered good nights flooding back. He pulled Emma's necklace from his pocket and stared at it for a long moment before placing it gently on the nightstand. "You may not remember me," he said softly, his voice trembling. "But I remember everything about you. And I'll remind you, Emma. I'll remind you how much you're loved The words hung in the air, a vow as unshakable as the man who made it. Tomorrow, the rescue mission would begin. Tomorrow, he would see his daughter again, and no matter how long it took, he would fight to rebuild the bond they once shared. Victor's cruel words might have sown seeds of doubt, but Charles's love for Emma was a force far greater. Nothing and no one would stand in his way. The Kingston estate, though grand and elegant, felt impossibly vast and empty. For Emma, it was a labyrinth of unfamiliarity. She spent most of her days in the sunroom, clutching her silver necklace or the stuffed rabbit her father had given her. Despite Charles's gentle attempts to engage her, she remained distant, her eyes clouded with mistrust and confusion. Charles had learned not to press her. Instead, he began weaving stories into their quiet moments together, small fragments of a life they had once shared. One afternoon, as Emma sat by the window, watching the garden sway in the breeze, Charles settled into a chair across the room. He held a small photo album in his hands. "This," he said softly, flipping to a page and holding it up, "was your favorite dress. You wore it to the park, the day you learned how to fly a kite." Emma's eyes flicked to the photo, but quickly returned to the garden. Charles continued, undeterred. "You were so proud when it lifted off the ground. You ran so fast, laughing the whole time. Your mother had to chase you to keep up." The corners of his mouth lifted into a faint smile as he added, "She tripped over her own feet and fell right into the grass. You couldn't stop giggling." Emma shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around the stuffed rabbit. Encouraged by her small reaction, Charles turned to another page. "This was at Christmas. We baked cookies together. Your mother let you add the sprinkles. You insisted on making a heart-shaped one for each of us." For a brief moment, Emma's lips parted as if to speak, but she quickly closed them again, her gaze dropping to her lap. The days stretched into weeks. Charles maintained his routine, filling the silences with stories of Margaret, their family traditions, and the memories he had cherished. He hoped that, somewhere deep inside, Emma's heart would begin to recognize the love behind his words. But it was a long uphill battle. One rainy evening, Emma wandered into Charles's study while he was away. The room smelled of leather and old books, its warm light casting shadows on the walls. She hesitated at the doorway before stepping inside, her small footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. On the desk, she noticed a photo frame lying face down. Curious, she picked it up and turned it over, her breath caught in her throat. The image showed a younger version of herself, sitting on a bench, laughing as a woman with golden curls tickled her sides. Beside them sat a man, Charles, his arm draped protectively around her shoulders. Emma's eyes were wide with joy, her tiny hand clutching the very necklace she now held close. She stared at the photo, the edges of a memory tugging at her mind. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling. Charles found her moments later, still standing by the desk with the photo in her hands. He froze in the doorway, unsure if he should speak. Emma turned to face him, her expression a mixture of confusion and longing. "Is this real?" she asked, holding up the frame. Charles's throat tightened as he stepped closer. "It is," he said gently. "That was us. Before everything." Emma looked back at the photo, her fingers tracing the image of her mother's face. "She always wore that smile when she was with you," Charles continued, his voice soft but steady. "And she would be smiling now, knowing you're here, safe." Tears welled in Emma's eyes, but she blinked them away. I think I remember," she said hesitantly. "The park, the cookies, she smelled like flowers." Charles's heart ached with a mixture of pain and relief. "Lavender," he confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. She loved lavender. For the first time, Emma didn't pull away when he knelt beside her. Instead, she looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. "Are you really my daddy?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles nodded, his eyes glistening with tears. "Yes, Emma, I am. And I've missed you more than words can ever say." Emma hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, wrapping her small arms around his neck. The embrace was tentative, fragile, but it was the first time she had willingly reached out to him. Charles held her close, his tears falling silently into her hair. The next morning, Emma wandered through the house with her stuffed rabbit and necklace in hand. She stopped at the doorway of her old room, its walls painted in soft pastel colors. Slowly, she stepped inside, running her fingers over the shelves lined with books and toys. She found another photograph tucked into the corner of a mirror. This one showed her and Charles reading a storybook together. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Emma held the photo in one hand and her necklace in the other. Memories began to surface, hazy but comforting. A warm voice reading to her, strong arms lifting her onto his shoulders, the sound of laughter echoing through the halls. For the first time, she felt a small spark of belonging. That evening, as Charles tucked her into bed, she clutched her rabbit and looked up at him. "Can you read me the Peter Rabbit story?" she asked quietly. Charles's heart swelled. "Of course, sweetheart." As he began reading, Emma listened intently, her fingers still wrapped around the necklace. The words felt familiar, like a lullaby from a time she had almost forgotten. By the time he reached the last page, Emma's eyes were heavy with sleep. "Good night, Daddy," she murmured softly, her voice filled with a trust he had feared would never return. Charles leaned down, brushing a gentle kiss against her forehead. "Good night, my sweet Emma." As he left the room, the photograph of their family still clutched in her small hand, Charles allowed himself a moment of quiet triumph. The healing had begun. The days turned into weeks, and the walls of the Kingston estate began to echo with the faint sound of laughter. Emma, still reserved, had started to let Charles into her world bit by bit. She wandered the garden more freely now, sometimes humming a tune Charles recognized from her childhood. One morning, Charles was reading in the sunroom when he heard her footsteps behind him. He turned, expecting her usual quiet observation, but instead, Emma approached him hesitantly, her silver necklace glinting in the sunlight. "Daddy," she said softly, her voice uncertain but clear. The book slipped from Charles's hands as he looked at her, his breath catching in his throat. The word hung in the air between them, more precious than anything he had heard in years. Tears brimmed in his eyes as he knelt to her level. "Yes, Emma," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm here." Without another word, she threw her arms around his neck, holding him tightly. It was the embrace he had dreamed of, and Charles felt a wave of emotion wash over him. The years of pain, loss and longing seemed to dissolve in that moment, replaced by an overwhelming sense of love and gratitude. "I remember now," Emma whispered into his shoulder. "You're my daddy. You always were." Charles closed his eyes, holding her close as tears streamed down his face. "And you're my world, Emma. You always have been." The transformation in Emma was subtle, but unmistakable. She began asking Charles questions about her mother, her childhood, and the life they had shared before it was torn apart. Together, they pieced together fragments of her memories, bringing them to life through photos, stories, and laughter. One day, as they sat in the garden flipping through an old album, Emma looked up at Charles. "Can we help other kids like me? The ones who don't have their daddy to find them?" Charles's heart swelled with pride and determination. "Yes, we can," he said. Months later, the Kingston estate hosted a grand event to announce the launch of the Emma Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to helping children who had been victims of abduction and abuse. The estate buzzed with energy as guests arrived, their support for the cause evident in their applause and donations. Emma stood beside Charles, her small frame now radiating confidence. She clutched her necklace for comfort as Charles delivered a heartfelt speech, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This foundation is not just about helping children find safety and healing," he said, his gaze sweeping across the crowd before landing on Emma. "It's about giving them the chance to rebuild their lives and reclaim their futures. And it's inspired by the bravest person I know, my daughter, Emma." The crowd erupted into applause as Emma smiled shyly, her cheeks flushing. Charles rested a hand on her shoulder, his pride evident. After the event, Charles and Emma walked together through the garden, the sound of the celebration fading behind them. "Mum would be proud, wouldn't she?" Emma asked, looking up at him. "She would be," Charles said with a smile. "She always believed in helping others, and she'd be so proud of you for wanting to do the same." Emma nodded, her fingers tracing the charm on her necklace. "I think I finally feel like I belong again. Like I'm home." "You are home, Emma," Charles said, kneeling to meet her gaze. "And as long as I'm here, you always will be." That night, as Charles tucked her into bed, Emma held her stuffed rabbit close and looked at him with a question in her eyes. "Will you tell me a story about Mommy?" Charles smiled, settling into the chair beside her. "Of course," he said, his voice warm. "Once upon a time, there was a little girl who had the most amazing mother. She loved to bake cookies, plant flowers, and sing lullabies." Emma listened intently, her eyelids growing heavy as the story unfolded. By the time Charles finished, she was fast asleep, her face peaceful. As Charles watched her, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The road had been long and filled with pain, but they had found their way back to each other. The next morning, as the sun rose over the Kingston estate, Charles and Emma began a new chapter in their lives. Together, they worked tirelessly on the Emma Foundation, channeling their pain into purpose. Emma grew into a compassionate young girl, determined to bring hope to others who had faced the same darkness she had endured. The silver necklace she wore became a symbol, not just of the love that had held her family together, but of the resilience and strength that had brought them through the storm. And as Charles watched Emma flourish, he knew that Margaret's spirit lived on in her. Their family was whole again, bound by love and ready to face the future together. The healing was complete, and happiness had returned to their lives, stronger and more meaningful than ever before.